Hello and welcome to the first of our release presentations from the 2002 Structural Waterproofing Conference. For the next 8 months or so, near the start of each month, we will be releasing a new presentation recording from the recent conference. As we release the recordings, we will pull these together as a playlist and a video library for all to reference and learn from. For the first recording, however, we are very much focusing on what is a hot topic within the structural waterproofing sector this year, the recent release of BS 8102-2002. Principally for this video, we are focusing on the panel debate that takes place at the end of the conference. What does our expert panel think of the new BS 8102 updates? Prior to the debate, however, and for those that may not have seen the new paper or the recent PCA webinar titled BS 8102, How Does This Change Our View to Waterproofing? James Berry from the PCA will introduce us to the new BS 8102 document. He's going to walk us through some of the key changes. He's going to walk over a bit of context to how it differs from the previous standards, and he's even going to highlight some of the contentious areas within the document. Now, I will say this particular recording release is a little bit longer than any other release that will come to follow, so you may want to get yourself a cup of tea. This particular video is 1 hour and 30 minutes. All preceding videos releases will only be about 20 minutes. But for professionals associated and involved within the structural waterproofing sector, and for those that want to learn more about best practice within the waterproofing sector, this is a worthwhile watch. So without further ado, let's transition over to the recording and PC's technical manager, James Berry.
An overview of 8102. As Steve pointed out, I wasn't part of the review panel. I don't almost sound like I'm bitter about it. I'm not. That's just the way it is. But because of that, the perspective I'll be giving on it is sort of looking at the finished article, not the process that got us there, but what we actually was produced, the finished thing. Not going to be going through all the changes that we just haven't got time. We've got to try and get it through in 20 minutes. So we're going to be looking at some of the big headlines. This session is to provide a bit of context for the panel debate that's going to come. So I'm going to try and not put too many opinions in. I've been sort of led to sort of try and be less divisive, or so. See how it goes. Start with the obvious, the changes. And I'm not talking about the flashy changes to the branding from the blue stripe to a red stripe, but the change in the title as well. The other thing I should probably say is that we've already alluded to a lot of the changes that has occurred in the document throughout the course of the day. So I guess what I'm trying to do is bring it into a neat package for a bit of background for us to come later. So we've gone from what was before the code of practice for the protection of below ground structures against water from the ground, and we've now got protection of below ground structures from water ingress. I think that's a lot more sort of, it's a broader spectrum, it's a wider document, don't get me wrong. Very, very clearly it tells us that we're no longer just thinking about water, groundwater, and we're thinking about all forms of moisture that can get into an underground structure. So we've seen the document get much bigger. We've gone from scraping 40 pages to now it's a document of around 55 pages. Now that's not just because of the change in the scope, but the scope has changed to reflect the change in the title. But actually when you start looking at it, if you look at the information that's provided for type A, B and C, the level of detail that's put in there is actually quite considerably more, which again, great credit to the document. So we now started looking at, and Michael Vernon, I think, did an excellent job earlier of describing the threat of surface water and why it should be considered. And that is very much now, you know, it says in the scope of the document that we now need to be thinking about these things. I know sort of before, you know, we had a lot of conversations in the summer of last year where we were, you know, inundated with news stories of, you know, London underwater. We had the likes of Brian May's basement under flood, and, you know, there was all this hysteria in the media. Is it right for us to start considering these things? Yeah, actually, I think it's the natural evolution. And if we don't, we're going to continue with images of you know, basements underwater, and that isn't good for anyone sat in this room. So it's absolutely the right thing for us to do, and it's the right step for the document to take. Moving on then. I am going to go through this sort of like from front cover to back cover. It seems like a tedious way of doing it. I'll try and make it as interesting as I can, but that is what it is. And it's the logical way to do it because that's the process of the document. So we'll go through it that way. Terms and definitions, there are a load of new terms and definitions in there and simple ones as well. Fully bonded, groundwater is finally described or given a definition in there as well, which wasn't included before. Hydrostatic pressure, free lime. All terms that you're going to be using on a daily basis, but they have now been included and put into the document. The one that I personally think is the biggest change in there is damp area, which has gone from an area which when touched might leave a light film of moisture on the hand, but no water droplets. Quite an unusual thing, but I know that comes from an ISE document. We now have an area which is slightly wet, but no seepage. So what is seepage? This is a term which is in the 2009 version of the document. Seepage, slow transmission of water through the structure, through discrete pathways of a structure. Let me carry myself. So we've now gone from having water which is essentially visible and wet, to water that is coming from certain or not coming from certain sources of water, essentially. It's not coming through the structure. So it's a bit more, that affects our grades of waterproofing. That's why that's quite significant, and we will get back to that. Design philosophy. Personally, and I think virtually everyone in the room is going to agree with me, well, I hope they are. I don't think I'll get much objections. This has been what makes 8102 so successful. It has been the backbone of essentially the CSSW qualification, the syllabus, and understanding and getting the premise of that design philosophy behind 8102 is fundamental to good waterproofing design. So that is for my mind, is a very, very vital part of the document. And that actually hasn't changed in any great deal in this version of the document that I perceive. So that's great. The fact that they stayed the same is brilliant. What we have seen some change to, and a part of the document that I think is very much underutilised and probably doesn't get the credit it does, but is very, very good for getting robust design. Figure 1, the flowchart, actually very often overlooked, very good part of the standard. If you go through figure 1 and you take that process, you use it, you're going to end up with a pretty robust waterproofing design. For those that are familiar with the old one, you'll know, whereas before, needs to not move away from the lectern, before yes, or just below yes, we had a solution. So you could do design and it tells you you've got a waterproofing solution. What we now have is a whole section below that, so it no longer tells you have a solution, it tells you you've got ongoing review and, I can't quite read that, and a finalised design. So it's telling you you've got to keep going basically. And how can that can't be a bad thing, because how often do we know that you do a great design, you can have a great install, but actually things change when you're on site. Designing on a bit of paper is one thing, but what you actually get on site is two very, very different things. And you need someone to be able to influence that design. So if you do need to make a change when it's on site, that needs to go to the right people. That needs to go to the waterproof designer, someone that's got the proper skill set to be able to make that decision. So this is telling us there needs to be more ongoing engagement. And I don't think anyone in this room will think that's a bad thing. So my hat's off. I think that is a great change, great addition to the document. The other thing that sits behind the design philosophy is it tells us to expect defects. So we are told to expect defects in two forms. And again, I think this is what's made this, the document in its sort of, it was standing for 13 years, it did a very good job. But it told us to expect defects. We had to expect defects from poor workmanship and inappropriate use of materials and the nature of those materials being used. That has now been expanded. We now have 4 considerations for defects. Ultimately, the design could be wrong. So it could just be that the person that's designed it hasn't done a very good job, and we've got to take consideration for that. The other one is follow-on trades. And this sort of goes back to what we were thinking about earlier, how you could have a great design, you can have a great install, and how often are we seeing it that actually the reason you have failure is because someone that's gone in afterwards with a whatever, a Sparky, whatever, has gone in and then put in gone through the membrane, the waterproofing system and compromised it. So now we are told we must consider that as part of our design. How do you consider the possibility of follow-on trades? Well, there's numerous ways we can do that. It could be site education. So if it's a large site, you can have speaking to the site manager, make sure that he is encouraging that the conversations for anyone that goes in the basement must be aware of the waterproofing layer, and not to compromise. If it is, it needs to be reported, etc. Simple things. Some of the manufacturers, I think, do this very, very well. But signalling on your membrane, who to contact and what it is and who it's installed by, because then they can contact you if it's damaged in any shape, way or form. But you need to be showing that you've given consideration to follow-on trades. And that's just two of the ways that you might be able to do it. The other slight change, it's not really significant, but we've gone from poor workmanship and inappropriate use to materials. That inappropriate use of materials have been put into the second point, essentially. So we've got the materials as the inappropriate use and the nature of those materials, and then poor workmanship as a separate point now. Existing structures, I'm not going to dwell on this for too long, has been significantly expanded on, gives you a lot more information on there. However, and this is a bit of a shameless plug, but I'm going to do it anyway. For those that have been doing waterproofing in existing structures in accordance with the PCA Code of Practice and all the Code of Practice and best practice guidance, I don't think you'd have anything to worry about with regards to the changes there. And if you are worried about it, they're all free at the back of the room, so go get yourself a copy there. All revised for 2022 versions. Water-resistant design. This is the section that starts talking about your water tables, your considerations for combined protection, the risk factors, starts introducing the premise of type A, B and C waterproofing. And I think someone else alluded, might have been you, might have alluded to this already, Michael. So again, this is just re-emphasising the point. Whereas before you only had to consider for essentially ground height, you now need to be considering to 150 mil above ground height for water. So absolutely, given the London floods and that we see, and that's a pretty good picture there that depicts it, we should be giving these things consideration. Very easy to do on a new build when you've got the option of a bit of paper in front of you can draw an bit of extra line and do all of that. Very difficult to try and comprehend when you've got an existing building. There's a bit of a grace, there's a bit of let out there that it tells you must do it as far as reasonably practicable. A bit of a health and safety term, but there it is. It's what it gives you. Otherwise, you're not going to be removing joists on most sort of first floor, ground floors just to try and get your waterproofing up to 150 mil. That's just not going to be viable. People are not going to allow you to do it. So there is a bit of a get out there and it sort of tells you, but that's what you should be aiming for. Let's get to probably the contentious bit, I guess. So the bit that's probably raised the most eyebrows since it's released would be Table 2. I don't think there's anything, I'm saying anything untoward there. It's the bit that's probably seen the most significant revision. So this is the new version. The first thing that's immediately obvious is we've now got a split in Grade 1. We've got Grade 1A, 1B. We will go into that in more detail in a short while. The other thing that's changed in there is we've got rid of the examples. So whereas previously we had for Grade 1 would have been a car park, for Grade 2 you had workshop, also in Grade 1, but they've been completely removed. Personally, and I said I'd try and keep opinion out of it, I think that's the right step. Because ultimately if you were asked to design a car park, you'd instantly go to Grade 1 as a default, but that's not necessarily what your client wants. What you've now got is it's encouraging to have further engagement with your client and design to what they are after. And that, again, has got to be a great thing. Because a car park can be very subjective. A public car park, probably get away with a Grade 1. If you're in the West End of London and they want to park their fleet of supercars, Bentleys, Rolls-Royce, whatever, down in a basement, then they ain't going to want a Grade 1. So actually having that level of engagement with your client, which I think removing those grades and preventing you go for a default grade, because that's what it says, and ensuring you get the right grade for your client, absolutely the right step. So, moving into those grades. Grade 3 is what Grade 3 has always been. So, no water ingress or damp patches acceptable, ventilation, dehumidification and air condition appropriate to use. That is the Grade 3 that we are all familiar with. It's not changed, it's habitable accommodation. If you're putting ventilation in, you're going to need to follow the guidance for ventilation which is going to be approved document F. So that is, hasn't changed. That's grade 3. Grade 2 has changed. It is quite a wordy description now. No seepage is acceptable. Damp areas as a result of internal air, moisture, blah, blah, blah. We can simplify that quite significantly, I believe. Damp as a result of condensation is acceptable. I think is pretty much the long and short of it. I personally believe actually that's what grade 2 was before. I think there was a bit of ambiguity over the previous grade 2. I think this clears it up quite nicely and you have a very well defined grade 2. That's so, actually thumbs up for that. I think good job done. Grade 1A is where we start seeing this split in grade. So the other thing that I think is weird is we've gone from grade 3, which is water ingress, and then suddenly we start talking about seepage. So there does seem a bit of a mix in the grades there, but I don't think it's significant. But grade 1A, seepage and damp areas from both internal and external sources are allowed if this does not impact the use of the space. So essentially you've got a leaky basement. A basement that lets water in, but it lets water in to a degree that you can still use it, and you might need some internal drainage. Fair enough. I think the grades that we've got so far, the 1, 2, well, 1A, 2, and 3, virtually mirror the previous grades. I think they are very usable. I think they're very clearly defined, and I don't think that any issues there at all. Where I think there may be some confusion and some need to adjust and getting used to is perhaps grade 1B. This feels like a very new grade, because it is, but we've got no seepage. Damp areas from internal and external sources are tolerable. So essentially what we've got here is a basement which is a bit leaky. So you've got to design it so you're allowed a damp area, but you've not got seepage. Quite hard to design to, I think, is what most people have sort of has been most concerned. It does give you guidance within that document how to do it. It says if you want a 1B structure, then you've got to be designing to BSEN 1992-3 2006. So it does give you some guidance in there to how to do it. But that, I think, is probably the one that's raised the most eyebrows, I think would be the fair way of putting it. Buried decks, there's a new section on buried decks, and I'm just going to repeat what Ben said to you earlier. He covered it very, very well, but it is a new section. They are notoriously difficult structures to waterproof. They are prone to failure. The guidance, that Ben sort of highlighted to you earlier is essentially replicated in this document. Ideally formed a reinforced in situ concrete, incorporating falls, and ensuring that actually you're preventing that. You're not preventing that water from discharging off that deck, so you've got a drainage layer that allows that water to get off. Good advice, pretty simple stuff. Type A, I'm going to cover just the headlines on this. There's not a lot to say here, but the big thing, obviously, we've removed sandwich waterproofing, so you can't have something that's encased within the structure. You can now have either external barrier waterproofing or internal barrier waterproofing. Fairly straightforward. I think that was quite a contentious one in the previous version from what I've heard. Obviously, the problem with this is there's no accessibility for remediation, so that has now gone. The other big change for barrier waterproofing is that we've gone from active clay liners to active core liners, just to reflect some of the range of products that are now out there. Type B, again, just the headlines. There's been quite a lot of changes to Type B, but essentially some of the key ones. It now promotes the use of a monolithic kicker. Makes sense. You're getting rid of an inherent sort of weak point, so it's standard stuff. And encourages the implementation of an on-site Q&A system. Again, simple stuff that makes sense. Type C, so we've got drain cavity protection. Stuff we're all familiar with, but it now says you've got to have your channel below the membrane. It seems fairly obvious in most instances, but we do see it or have seen it where you have a membrane that's only either not even covered or you have a membrane abutting the drainage channel. It's now telling you it should be directly below, otherwise you're losing half the capacity of the channel. Self-explanatory stuff, but it's put in there. Drainage channel should be at the wall floor junction. Again, fairly straightforward stuff, but now included. It does say, you can do, if you can't get it at the base of the wall, you can increase the capacity of the void to compensate accordingly. There is some great guidance in there as well about multi-storey basements as well and how to design for those. The other thing, and I think this is particularly high risk, so I have again put in some more opinion in there, is it now gives you information on the use of inverted cavity drain systems. So there was no reference to that before, and it now acknowledges it could potentially be done, but they are very, very high risk. It says, you know, a situation sort of vaulted ceilings, or if you are going to put it on a flat soffit, make sure there's falls, but it tells you to go and get expert advice. So I would very much wholeheartedly, you know, agree with that. Type C systems again, but discharge pumps and sumps and pumps. It tells you now you should be doing a risk assessment to assess where you should be discharging to. So if you want to use gravity or pump system, it tells you should be doing a risk assessment. I'm quite intrigued as to how you do a risk assessment and come up with the idea that gravity draining was less risk averse. I'm keen to, you know, perhaps that's something for the panel debate. But the other thing, flood loops. James, I know this is one of your babies, is now encouraged in areas which are prone to flooding. So again, it's this more holistic approach to thinking about if you are in an area that is likely to flood, you know, how do you make sure that that system is still going to be able to discharge water and you know, not cause you any issues. And again, another point that Ian raised earlier, battery backups should be included, as in must be included. Overall thoughts. So I'm going to thank Joe for this. Joe's Photoshop skills, not mine. It was never a broken document. It always kind of worked well. It served us well for the last 13 years. There was nothing that was fundamentally wrong with it. It was evolution rather than sort of revolution. It wasn't reinventing the wheel. It was just fixing a few spokes, and I think that's what we've got. I think most of you would have been adopting most of the points in there. If you were complying with PCA best practice at the time, you pretty much would have been the way there for the new standard anyway. But I guess the point of the whole panel debate is, you know, we've got this new document, and go back to the wheel analogy, are some of the spokes still a little buckled? I'm going to leave that one over to you.
So if I could invite our panel up onto the stage, please. We have Ben from CSSW Waterproofing. We already heard from him today. Welcome, Ben. Emily, who chaired session 2. James Hockey, if you could come up too, please. Kevin, as our chairman of the review group. And Michael Earl, I know you're there somewhere, I've seen you. And Patrick from Utah. If we could all stand up on the stage. And I was on it too. But I'm a bit protected because I can hide. So I'm going to ask the first one. I'm going to ask the first question. And it's a very easy question. This is a nice relaxed sort of run into this. But it kind of struck me, what's the bit that we're most proud of? What is the bit of the document that we are kind of most pleased got in there? Now I'm going to tell you what mine is first, and I'm going to thank Richard actually for this. The simplest thing of all that we changed in this document was a note that you should have continuity between the vertical and the horizontal DPC above ground level. What a ridiculously stupid thing not to have had in the previous documents, and what a seismic difference that makes. There is now no excuse for finishing your waterproofing and leaving a gap. You have to have continuity. Simple, delivers a really good result. So, Ben, your favourite bit?
My favourite?
What bit are you most pleased that we got in?
I'm going to be controversial. It's grade 1B.
Emily, moving on very quickly.
So yeah, to clarify, I wasn't actually on the panel, but my colleague Jenny Burridge was, and I've sort of reviewed and commented on the document. I think, as a structural engineer, probably the thing that I think is most useful that's in there is the link between the grades and crack widths and how that relates to Eurocode 2.
James.
Listed buildings, the expanded stuff on dealing with existing structures, protection of systems after they're installed, podium decks, multi-level basements.
Enough already. Enough already.
I mean, yeah.
Enough. You know, there's 3 more people to follow.
I think expanding. I think generally, like, the fact that it's, there's no like massive sort of sea change, extra, type D waterproofing or anything. It's just expansion of what was and refinement of sort of what was there. So for me, it's all the bits of extra polish.
Kevin?
I think probably just the slight change in addition to the flow chart in figure 1.
Michael?
It gets you to double check and risk assess in your assessment of your design before implementing it.
Mine is probably podium decks, first off, because there was nothing really before, and then following that, a bit biased, but the emphasis on getting the right person or the right people involved as early as possible. I know it's always been there, but really now it's much more direct.
Well, what I'll say is that if we have a hiatus and there are no questions from the floor, which I seriously doubt, that was one of the things that I was going to pick up actually from this morning's Ben's session this morning, from the thing that you've mentioned, and my looking at the standard again, that specialist element, bringing that specialist in at the earliest point, actually that is open to a little bit of interpretation, because it doesn't say you need a consultant, it says you need a waterproofer. Actually what the standard is, it's a waterproofing specialist. Patrick?
I particularly like the gratuitous use of the word flood in the document. I like the reaffirmation of the risk assessment, the importance of understanding the complexity of these designs and obviously what's involved around that. And I think as an industry, we really need to push that. I think Steve said it earlier, there's a reasonable amount of knowledge up on the stage, but there's a hell of a lot more out there. And, between us, we add a lot of value to these projects, and I think we undersell ourselves sometimes. So let's push that added value as an industry.
Cool. Questions? I could dominate this. I'm not going to unless I have to, but there will be questions. Like I say, if you've got one, save them up. Don't save them up. Put your hand in the air. Sue and Jade are scanning the room. I will be too. Questions? Most important document in our industry, so there must be them. That one first.
Good afternoon. Nice to see you all in comfortable chairs anyway, so hopefully none of you are going to fall asleep. Probably a little bit of a question right out there really, is the construction industry seems to be involved more and more in off-site manufacture. Have any of you got any comments on, say, basements being off-site manufacture and just coming straight to site, a waterproof box being dropped in a hole?
What a good idea. They'd need a bloody big crane though, won't they? Who's on to pick that up?
I've had some experience in dealing with issues in some of the prefab basement systems, and at least one of those was they were designing based on an assumed hydrostatic head based on site investigation information, which when they actually came to, it's a bit like what Steve was talking about earlier, when they came to build, was different to what they designed for, and it basically caused issues. So I guess what point I'm trying to make is, I think if as long as you followed all the guidance in the standard in the same way that you would do if it was being constructed, in the hole in the ground, I don't see that it would necessarily be that different. Okay, well, I've got a slightly, I'm going to pinch, I think, Ben, you want to come in? Did I get that right?
I've got some thoughts.
Okay, well, so have I, and I've got the microphone, so I'm going to have mine first. There's a big problem with off-site manufactured basements, is that you have to build on top of them. And so if you've got a basement that is light enough to crane onto site, then the chances are you can't build a very substantial or very heavy superstructure on top of it. So it's limited by its dimensions. The only other experience I've got of pre-manufactured panels being used as earth-retaining walls and as the primary basement waterproofing structure came actually from GPI, and I'm going to out them a little bit now, but they came under some pressure some years ago to put guarantees on concrete panels with essentially gasket fittings. And there is a technology that had come from Germany. It had been imported as a unit of construction. Essentially, in theory, it was a highly effective form of waterproofing because the concrete was incredibly well made, and the diaphragms were incredibly well fitting. The problem is that the things moved during construction, and they moved very, very slightly. And because they'd moved off their axis very, very slightly when the basement was backfilled, they leaked like sieves. And it was incredibly difficult to do anything with them, and left the insurance company with a huge problem of how to fix it.
Yeah.
And actually, the problem was that the amount of money available through insurance was nowhere near enough to cover the cost of remediation. So my only experience with off-site manufactured concrete being used underground was a problem. Now, what I will also say is that I have come across the most bizarre waterproofing solution I've ever seen, which was the use of wood. So I've seen a wooden basement go in. Didn't work. Ben?
Brilliant. I had 4 thoughts. Steve stolen one, which is worth repeating, is repairability is often the challenge. My other thoughts are I had somebody who they manufacture off-site stuff for car garages, and it's like essentially interceptors and things like that, where they're all waterproof, and they were saying, well, why don't we take these and make them habitable? So it's essentially it's type B steel that they would be craning into site, and they were looking at that. And I think one thing I want to say is let's not rule anything out. I think we have to get innovative. We have to get so much better at carbon footprint and that sort of thing. So that's one thought. My other thought is the big issue that I see as a consultant when it's a replicated system is your increase in risk. So if you do design one and build it 700 times, your risk has just gone up 700 times, and that's terrifying to me. I had a 4th thought, but I can't remember what it is. There you go.
Michael, please.
As you all know, the standards are there, but they are open to interpretation, which I'm all for, because being a consultant and expert witness, that's part of what I do. There is a new section in BS 102 now about modular construction, so insulated concrete formwork, block work. I would possibly count pre-made units as modular, and it very clearly states in BS 102 they are to be seen as high risk. So it is technically, if you like, in there. Sorry, Nick.
And that was a good point. There was quite a lot of debate on ICF and what we should do with ICF. And I think that even though there was a lot of debate, the outcome was pretty much uniform.
We were all pretty much on the same page.
We hate the stuff. As far as a solution for underground that has to be waterproof, ICF is nightmarish, and we don't like it. So it is. We're not saying it can't be done, but we should consider it to be extremely high risk. AD.
It's a question relating to James, actually. On your slides, why were you peeking around the wall at the end on that flooded basement?
Well, it's not AD. That's very mean. I have to say that Graham Stone sat in the front. I think he recognised a lot of his photographs then. He gave me those about 10 years ago, and I've recycled them so many times you wouldn't believe. So thank you, Graham, for those.
So I've got another one here, Steve.
Hudson at the back. Oh, sorry. Hudson next. Please. Is that all right?
Bob had a hand up as well.
Who else did we have?
Bob over there and someone over there.
Hi there. The most commonly heard concern I hear about this standard is that it shifts a lot more of the risk from the designer to the contractor. Do you think that's a fair comment?
Who wants to pick that up? I'll have a go at it first, if you like. Isn't a lot of the time the contractor the designer anyway? And does the standard not actually, rather than shifting it, I would like to think of it as the standard actually recognising what actually happens commonly. And I would also, because I love you all equally, of course, but I would also say in a lot of situations, the best person to do the design is the contractor, because they have to deliver it and they are responsible for all the changes as that site moves through its construction phase. So maybe it does, but then the question back to you, and perhaps that the panel can pick up, is that the right or the wrong thing? Patrick, please.
Yeah, I mean, all the different parts have to work together. It really upsets me when we say, oh, the designer and the contractor, and we split that. We're a team, and whether we're a standalone designer or we're doing specialist design work around contamination or bespoke construction methodology, modern methods of construction like off-site fabrication basements, or we're the contractor and we're installing it, we're all trying to achieve the same objective, which is a basement which hopefully doesn't leak. So everybody in that chain, everybody who's involved has to share that responsibility, and nobody should be saying to you, oh, you're taking all the risk here because you're installing it. If you install it to a poor quality, then yeah, it's on you. But if you do your job correctly to the best of your ability, then you've nothing to worry about. As should everyone in that chain.
Just jump in by all means if you've got comments to make on it.
I mean, in terms of the way that we work, it's like we're designing or taking responsibility for what we install anyway, so I don't see that it kind of has a bearing, really. It's more important for me that if there are designers up the chain, whether that be independents or suppliers, that what is being produced and provided is hopefully kind of in line with what we would want to do anyway. I think that's the sort of ideal scenario, and I think as we go on, that's getting more and more to be the case.
I'll come in. I think that I wasn't aware of that it's more the contractor's issue. Obviously, I'm biased. I'd rather that. I don't want the risk. But I think also just on principle and in terms of what happens if something goes wrong, the contractor's the only party who actually has the relatively easy propensity to send two guys to site and do some resin injection. Whereas if I'm at fault, in reality, I can't do that. And so you end up with an insurance claim with me that's going to run with insurance parties and go for however long, and everything escalates and gets bigger. Where at all possible, I would much rather we have a specialist contractor who can do in-house design. I take design so far, you tweak it and build it, and you carry the risk. That I think just works better in terms of if something does go wrong, it can be put right and it's not catastrophic. That's obviously a slightly selfish viewpoint, but that's where it's at for me.
I think as part of the process as well, it's important to recognise your limitations or where you're not so strong. I don't see many structural waterproofing design reports which start with, here is the information I have reviewed and this is what this report doesn't cover. And if you don't list those limitations of your report as a contracting company who's taking on responsibility for waterproofing design, then you are deemed to have assessed the risk, which is outlined as part of BS 8102, which includes, the hydrogeology, the gas risk assessment, any petrochemical contamination. So if you are putting a design report together and you are not considering those elements, you should list them as a limitation, an opening paragraph in those design reports. I hope you're all doing that, but if you're not, please start doing that.
Yeah. Michael, I think you were
going to so from my point of view, there's a lovely flow design chart at the beginning which James showed quite usefully, and there's this lovely new section at the bottom about like the handover, the commissioning of the system, all this sort of stuff. As a designer and not someone that gets my hands dirty, that bit worries me slightly, because how far as a designer do I have to inform or cover myself that as part of the design all of these things need to be ticked off as well? And I don't think it's out of the question that someone's going to miss something when it's on site, and it's going to be deemed their responsibility as the designer at design stage. So it worries me slightly, but...
I think the other point on that is the other bit in there which clearly talks about good communication between all parties. And I think that's the bit that tends to miss on most sites where things start going wrong. So the guy who's done the design, spoken to the architect in the design team meeting, contractor goes down, main contractor goes in, he then changes something, the build, the scheduling, is they're not.
But what do we do? Do we phone them every day?
This is the whole bit, which comes back to where the emphasis, generally speaking, will end up more with the specialist installing contractors, because if you go on site, or your technicians are trained, they go on site and you've got it's applied product A to supposed to be an RC deck here, for example, and it turns out to be concrete planks, or they've put rather than a concrete upstand, they've installed a bit of 4x2 timber, and saying, you know, you can't apply that product to it. There is a change, and somebody's got to communicate that back to make the adjustment, both in product or the change it back to a concrete upstand, because they're the fundamental changes. It's the detail. It's not the big overall, is it a Type C system? It's the changes where the detailing goes, which usually occur on site, and that's where that element of the adjustment in the design and having the knowledge and understanding and using specialist contractors, which is why ultimately you will end up proportionally carrying more of the design responsibility, and I think that's the way, you know, the flow works.
So you've got a question. Sorry, James, did you have a rounding off?
Oh, yeah, I've done a little bit of sort of design only kind of consultant type stuff, and to be honest, I don't really want to, rather just do the the contracting stuff. But when I did do that, I did the design work, but then when it came to the actual construction phase, I was quite hands-on on site, you know, so regular visits, looking at what they were doing, seeing what they were doing. Some of the photos I had up earlier were as a result of that.
God, I bet you're a pain in the arse.
Is that, you know, as an independent, as a designer kind of a thing, is that something that you guys are, do you think that you're doing, you know, you're working in with the guys on site to kind of make sure it's right sort of thing?
Yeah, it is something I've definitely looked at and would like to accommodate, but when you've designed 80 basements and then suddenly 40 of them start in the same month, your capacity is stretched, and that isn't constant. So it's being able to manage that as a small team of 2 of us, in my example, to do that. But it'd be nice to have. Nice to have, I'm afraid.
I would think of that differently. So if I'm designing it, I've already got design responsibility. If I'm also on site, really, am I responsible for workmanship defects as well? Because it's kind of QA, right? I should be seeing if there's a defect. So I don't really want that responsibility, because then I'm carrying loads of responsibility. And then I'm always challenged with, you know, I might want to do that because it's best, but my client doesn't want to shell out for an extra, you know, my time's not cheap. And if I got to travel to site and look at stuff, there's no way I can see all of it. So I would much rather have a specialist contractor who knows what they're up to and really owns it and does a thorough job. There just isn't the money for me to be doing QA, and our insurers don't like it when we do QA. So we would do sort of 3 site visits on a 1-year build, a 1-year basement build. It's minimal, right? It's such a soft touch. What does that really do? Well, it helps us say, actually, the build is broadly correct. However, you're getting this, and this wrong. You need to bump up your quality assurance, blah, blah, blah. But for us, there just isn't the money. Even if we wanted to, we wouldn't get paid to do that.
So can we have our next question, please?
Hi there, it's about grades. Why have we got so many grades now? We had 3, now we're up to 4. Surely it's a case of either the building's dry or the building's wet. Yeah, surely water shouldn't be getting in because it's waterproofing specialists.
Does somebody prime you?
Wet, dry. Are you saying wet, dry? Because I'm going for it. So for me, 1A, 1B is wet, and 2 and 3 is dry. But I actually have a big issue with people saying, "Oh, we're designing to grade 3," because obviously it's conditional of the ventilation. Yeah, correct. So you, as a waterproofing designer, I'm designing to grade 2. So I'm trying to keep it dry, and then conditional of the use, they'll put ventilation in, depending on what they're using the structure for. So 2, 3 dry, 1 A and B is wet. So it's just wet, dry, and that, you know, we talked about it before. We didn't all agree during the drafting process. I actually gave up at this point, and I'm sure the guys won't mind me saying this, because it does happen in these committees when there's a lot of people and a lot of strong opinions, and sometimes it's better to just stop talking. But for me, it's wet dry, and that is the way we are as an organisation. We're thinking it's 1A, 1B wet, 2, 3 dry. So what is your expectation as a client? Anyone jump in on me? Do you want a wet basement or a dry basement?
Out of the 12 months or so of review, I would suggest probably 33% of the time was spent debating table 2. I mean, days, hours, variations of it. So what is there is a compromise, I think is a fair way of putting it. Which could get
or a loss, as far as
which is a lot of compromise, which in terms of trying to get some form of consensus. Otherwise, I would probably quite happily say that if we were carrying on to debate table 2, the document wouldn't be out yet.
I agree.
All right, that's to give you an idea of the differences of opinions on and interpretations of both 1990 version, 2009 version, the variation you see there, and going from what Patrick described quite eloquently is it's wet or it's dry, and everything in between.
I mean, expanding on what Patrick said, I've got a slightly different opinion of it. I think there's still place for wet, damp, dry. So I still think there is that damp because of condensation, because of maybe external dampness coming in. What I'm not so happy with is the 1B, because for me, what could be a 1B one day might be a 1A the next day. Because surely if there's some capillary dampness coming through, what must be a discrete defect in that structure, surely if that's tested, that will leak. So yes, we're giving you a 1B structure. Can you guarantee me it won't be a 1A later on? What does that look like? So for me, it's a little bit messy. If I'm defending someone in court and they think they've got a 1B, I might go with it, but we'll see.
I think from a practical perspective, you can just use 1A, 2 and 3 as you did before. I think 1B for me, it's kind of like, the only thing I can think of is like, you know, you go and look at an existing brick built cellar, it's got whitewashed walls and a, you know, bit of a concrete slab in it, and you've got efflorescence on the walls. You might not have any liquid water penetration at that point in time.
That's the thing that worries me.
And you're kind of like, well, the current environment is 1B, but you know, the day after tomorrow, yeah, you could get seepage. So I think the way that it panned out in part was associated with not trying to, at least from my perspective, fundamentally change the grades from what they are now, because I think that would have created quite a lot of confusion within the wider construction industry, where there isn't a great understanding of the grades from the 2009 revision, and I think it would have been more of a step backwards if we had made certain changes that were considered, which I think, the thing that I was arguing for was to try and avoid confusion of the rest of the industry, and I think where we got to in the kind of the compromise of the panel actually sort of achieves that, and the only downside is you probably just have to write 1A instead of 1, that's it.
We did at one point have grade 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I think actually where we got to was...
I would also add, at one point we had grade 1 and grade 2. That was my draft. I lost. And at this point, Ben, I'm going to bring you in, because you were my biggest adversary.
Thank you.
How long have we got?
So I think it's interesting that what used to be grade 2, it was fascinating to me that there was actually a difference of opinion amongst us as a panel. What did that mean? Which I've checked out with many across the industry, that was the case. So the reality was, with the 2009 version, some people in the room would say that needs to be waterproof, but you might have condensation. And a whole bunch of other people thought, well, that could be concrete with a damp patch coming through the ground. And so from 2009 until this year, we had 3 forms of waterproofing, a third of which there was big disparity about what people actually meant by that. And I guess plus side is we've cleared that up now. We've got grade 1B and grade 2. I quite like grade 1B. If you're trying to build a big, large concrete basement and you're going to have car parks in it, your car's going to drive in, it's going to have some moisture on it, and what the heck is the point in making it any more waterproof? But you also might not want to provide drainage. And so to me, that's the ideal situation to be doing grade 1B, and it's a performance specification, and then you can send someone in to do resin injection if it's not meeting that. I think that's fairly straightforward, very practical. I really like that. Personally, I can't fathom when I will ever specify grade 2. And that's like, there's the difference of opinion that you can see in the past 5 minutes. So
I think also the other thing is where things get off is obviously you've got people who very much do a lot more on the residential, and then you've got other things because it's structures below ground. It's not just basements.
Yeah.
And there's lots of structures below ground which have multiple uses, where a damp patch, which may or may not seep at certain times of the year when it rains, is fine. Yeah, I mean, that's like people say to me, how can you design to grade 1? Well, ultimately, if you really want to design a grade 1, you're going to waterproof it and then drill a hole in it.
Yeah.
Okay? Because that's the only way you can guarantee you've got a leak, yeah, or seepage, yeah? Because ultimately it's all about assessing the risk, yeah? And if I built a reinforced concrete structure and just put water bars in it, based on the ground conditions, siting conditions, is it going to leak? Or is it, if you've got a very low water table, very draining soil, well built concrete structure, and if it did leak, and I've got a bit of seepage, then it's the impact on what the use of that structure is. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if it is only a car park, well, possibly all right. But in the car park, if you had a leak on the wall, it's probably, and it runs down to a little drain, it's fine. But if it's leaking through the deck onto your car, whole different matter. Mm-hmm. And you can't have a grade 1 there and a grade 1 on the wall, and you'd have to say, well, I need a grade 2 or on the soffit. And that's, so it's the use of the structure. It's all about assessing the risk. You're never going to design a grade 1. But then if you put an external waterproofing system on, and you had the defect, whether it be in the workmanship or the product, then what's the consequence of that? It may leak, in which case you could get seepage. So it is about assessing the risk and what it's being used for. And part of it is, what does the client want? Because we can talk about 1A, 1B, 2 and 3. What the client wants is what the client wants. And if he says, I want it dry, bone dry, and RH of 50 and a constant temperature of 21 degrees, then that's what you've got to try and do. Now you might need an M&E guy to do your ventilation, yeah? But then that's all part of the design team, isn't it? It's like if you come across and you think, right, I've got a surface water flood potential, I'm going to get somebody who knows about flooding. If I've got ground gas, my knowledge on ground gas is limited, you get somebody in the design team who has greater knowledge, yeah? And that's the whole point of the document. The first half of it is probably more important than the other part.
Emily, I'm kind of, I know Ben wants to come in, but yeah. I'd like to know your thoughts. You've actually a pragmatic female voice at this juncture might be useful.
So obviously I was not part of the conversation on sort of developing the grades, but...
Did Jenny say anything about it? Did
she I can't help. I think my experience is trying to sort of distill the information as part of our role at the Basement Information Centre is to help people with interpreting it, and even in a sort of 4-page document it's promoted, just to try and summarise the changes, it's promoted so much conversation, and my fear is how that is sort of relayed to clients and whether they really understand what they're getting. And I guess while there's still this debate going on, I understand why you'd want to get away from having examples, but because I realised you probably need sort of 3 paragraphs to explain it's a car park, but it's this kind of car park with this kind of, But yeah, I think these kinds of conversations are really useful so that people can start to sort of get towards the same point in what they're actually saying you get for each of these grades. So the clients ultimately, the aim is that they know what they're getting and they're happy with what they get. And it's hard to articulate, and I think that's why we're in the position we're in.
Yeah, before I bring Ben back in, I'll kind of show my hand. I supported totally having the examples removed for the reasons that James outlined in his presentation. What we were doing was providing a shopping list for clients that actually didn't look right. But I also think that the 4 grades of waterproofing we have here, or 3 grades, 1 subdivided, is not just for us to consider how we deliver that, but actually that will be used by our clients as a shopping list, and we'll be asked to perform to that standard. It would be fine if it was all push, but it won't be. It'll be if it was all pull, but it's not. It's going to be push as well. And that's quite honestly, and it's been well rehearsed. But that was where I still have a bit of a problem with 1B. And I understand why you like it. I would understand why most construction lawyers would like it. But I'm looking at things very differently. I'm not a waterproofer. I don't have to go out and deliver this stuff. My job at the PCA is to promote waterproofing to as wide an audience as possible and to promote competence so you can get to as many people as possible using your services to deliver good basements. And that's the bit that I trip up a bit with 1B, because it just takes away some of that, if you like, crystal clarity for me. And that's why I see it the way I do. Ben?
I'd agree. My favourite version of Table 2 was wet, damp, dry. But I think what was missing from that, and I think, to be honest, is still missing, is, well, how wet? So if some seepage is permissible, how much is too much? And if some dampness is permissible, how much is too much? And I think that what we now do is specify. So we will do a performance specification. I think you're actually right, Steve. We were on site yesterday. We're looking at a job for a milling company. They make the oats that you will have eaten for breakfast or whatever. And we were on site yesterday, but the client is actually in Canada, and we're trying to get to the client and say, how dry do you actually need these 200 meters of tunnels and all the rest of it? And we're really trying to dig into that and say, okay, how dry do you need it to be? Once we've distilled that, then we will do a performance specification that will go out to a contractor, and that's how dry they need to build it. And it will be grade 1B, and there will be a limit to the maximum permissible size of a damp patch. That's how we're going to play it.
So if I get lumps in my porridge in 2 years' time, it's your fault. Do it. More questions?
Yeah, I wonder if you would indulge me. I'm so sorry to go back to the previous discussion, but I'm a bit disconcerted. It wasn't conclusive enough for me regarding the emphasis or greater emphasis on design. So I'll explain where I'm coming from. So mostly what I see is from an expert witness point of view, where I see failures. And so really what I'm trying to get at here is this whole notion about you've all demonstrated ably that you all work to the same conclusion, but we all know there's something called human nature, and particularly on sites, it does manifest many times. It keeps many construction lawyers very, very busy all the time. So I'm just trying to get to the bottom of how efficacious is that reference, or could there have been more emphasis on the need for someone who really grips the whole 360 perspective to make sure that so-and-so is talking to so-and-so, that there really is continuity in that quality assurance that was brought up this morning, because I can see this as potentially, if, for example, you set that in the context of a below-ground structure that's got persistent hygroscopic moisture pressure, and in this 10, 20 years, that's formidable, 360, 725, it's just constant pressure on and it's going to expose workmanship issues, material issues, design issues, obviously. And so I just, as I say, I didn't feel it was quite conclusive, or whether you as a team feel that was, well, you brought it up from being not really mentioned before in the previous example, and is it, as I say, is it suitably robust in terms of its emphasis?
I think before we answer the question, describing this lot as a team might be pushing it.
If I could actually just add to that, I do realise, and I think, Ben, you really touched on that, I do absolutely agree with you, that someone like yourself could provide a good initial robust design, then you would give it to a contractor who's suitably skilled and experienced under a contractor design portion part of a JCT. That would probably be the best way to overcome that. But
okay, competent persons rather than team.
From my opinion, Mark, is there is definitely a flavour in BS 812 about this coordination, about this holistic, everybody getting on, communicating. It's still in there, but the problem is we have too many people that want to get involved possibly. So it might be someone like myself or Ben, it could be a supplier, it could be a contractor. I'm going to shoot myself in the foot here, but maybe the specialist contractor is the best position for it to be in because they could do everything effectively. But there are those other parties out there, and as long as that work's available, I'm going to continue doing it. But I think that's why the document looks like it was. We couldn't make it any more robust because we would be singling out one person, which would have to be someone outside of those other parties, in my opinion, which I don't think is practical, unfortunately. It's my opinion anyway.
I think, well, I'm not going to steal everybody's thunder, but just to follow on from that point, the other thing that it was very tempting to do with this review was forget where we came from. Because actually, this standard is not just for new build basements. This standard has to be workable with renovations and conversions as well, as private domestic dwellings, not just large multi-storey sites with lots of concrete going into them. And if we'd have chosen to go down that route, it would have been a very different document and very focused on that large project new build, which it can't be. So please.
Can I come in?
Yeah, of course.
I think I kind of like where you're coming from, Mark, but we've got to work in the real world, haven't we? And the construction industry is a bit of a mess. Procurement is a mess, and the way people shift responsibility around it is a mess. And by writing a very niche British standard, you don't get to change the whole industry. So I think, even if this team had been in complete agreement that you need some, star competent waterproofing person who's going to own everything, it just wouldn't happen. You wouldn't get that insight reality. So I think where we're at, I'm quite pleased about. I quite like the word appointed. I think it's as good as we're going to get. I think we're a lot better than where we were. I think we're doing quite well as an industry. I'm really grateful for the input from the insurance companies like LABC and NHBC. I think they really have our backs and are pushing for really competent design. And if it wasn't for that, you'd still have someone down Jason's just getting the waterproofing and going for it.
I think sort of just talking about a sort of separate coordinator role, if you think about sort of the way CDM went of trying to integrate that and really get people to take responsibility, that obviously, there was a feeling that sort of separate coordinator role almost became too tick box and people weren't integrating it enough. And so I think that's the real danger of having a sort of separate coordinator, that people almost sort of outsource that risk and don't sort of take as much responsibility as in integrating it into the sort of design. So, the structural engineer sort of feeling that someone else is responsible for it and that they don't have to, having that sort of real responsibility integrated with your work, I think is important.
I think I'd say, if I may, also saying that sums up for me is people don't do what you expect, they do what you inspect. For instance, structure, thank you. That maxim often plays true, really. But it's just because, again, the high risk of these things, and if they're going to be for the long term, that's going to keep on working consistently, albeit with maintenance and all the rest of it, I just wonder whether emphasising this right up front could pay real dividends, and if someone wants, obviously, committing to.
I think if I may, I'm going to come back again, if I may. Just if you'd have predicted where we are now 20 years ago, we would not have considered that we would be in this place. The quality and the reliability of waterproofing, I think, has improved out of sight. And you don't take my word for it. Take this gentleman's word for it. Take the insurer's word for it. The level and the frequency of their claims have diminished. They're much more relaxed about insuring underground structures with what you have created. And I don't think that we can, as Ben says, I'm back Ben to the hilt, we can't change the world with one document, but we can start and we can continue the journey that we're on, continually professionalise that whole kind of work stream, that whole work package. And I think that we're doing that. I think this document, one of the things that it certainly does is it reinforces those roles and it moves it forward incrementally again. I don't think we could ever have got to a place where we prescripted that role, because it would have been rejected by industry, because it wouldn't have been able to deliver it.
No, but I also think, yes, you know, it's moved forward. It's somewhat more comprehensive. The other bit I quite like about it is it's slightly harder to take certain things out of context and use it without referring back to something like the risk assessment. So subsurface drainage, you know, you can sit and talk about subsurface drainage, but actually the only reason you're putting subsurface drainage in is you've done the full risk assessment and got to that point and deemed it's an appropriate aspect on that site. But if you just read 6.4 on subsurface drainage, it will tell you to go back to the risk assessment, because until you've done that. So there's lots of bits like that where you're crossing over the document, refers you back to the doing the assessment and assessing the risk before you've made those choices. And I think that's probably one of the other, I suppose, improvements in it. But I think also, because it can't be prescriptive, it's a guidance document. Yeah, best practice guidance document, whatever you want to call it. But it enables things like the Structural Waterproofing Group or the PCA to look at certain sections where perhaps we think greater clarity needs to be. Emily touched on about the examples for different grades. So there's no reason why PCA or people in this room can create a document which gives lots of different examples, because, you know, a car park on a plan, talking to an architect, if somebody says car park on it, you don't know what car is going to be used, because somebody might want an NCP car park. It doesn't matter if it leaks. It may be used for allowing floodwater in, you know, for flash filling and that sort of thing to protect the rest of the building. So again, then other people might say, well, actually, I don't want it, you know, lime dripping through the stuff. And other people, actually, it's their fleet of, you know, luxury sports cars, and actually it's more of a car park stroke museum showroom for them, but on the plan it will still say a car park. So it goes out to tier 1 contractor, tenders for it. I just want a grade 1, mate. Concrete box is fine. That's where the issue, that's why we took them out. But there's no reason why you can't do some sort of, even whether it's case studies, to show the different types of grades and performance. But these are things that the PCA do. We're looking at things like, you know, talking about modular construction and high risk. Yeah, okay. Well, you know, if you've got modular construction, that's not to say you can't, but then, you know, we've got the opportunity here as a group to create a guidance document based around that type of construction in relation to waterproofing. Yeah, which then will start to drive the next, I suppose, evolution of, you know, 8102 in 2032.
Well, I think you make a really important point that, you know, we're speaking predominantly to members of the association. I know we've got lots of guests here today that aren't members, but actually we have the mechanism inside the association to drive our own agenda and to drive those standards on. And, you know, the waterproofing committee meetings, the waterproofing group meetings are very well attended, but you're all welcome. And if you've got inputs, come along. James sends out the agendas and tells you when it's going to be. The meetings do get pretty big sometimes, so we ask that it's one representative a company usually, unless you've got something specific to say. But that's the forum for bringing these things forward and the catalyst for the creation of either better or new standards. We don't have to wait for BSI to do this stuff. We're dynamic, we're quick on our feet, we're responsive, we're reactive, and we can do that stuff. And we do that stuff. Another question. Bob.
Hi, thank you. I'd be interested in something a bit more specific, if I can sort of move the conversation around a little bit. I was interested earlier on when Steve Wilson, I think, from EPG was giving his presentation, where he pointed out what appears to be the contradiction regarding drainage outfalls and what we're supposed to do with all this water, this coming in behind particularly our Type C waterproofing systems. Can I ask what you feel about that?
Who's going to be brave enough to pick that?
I'll straight out the traps. It goes back to, again, at the beginning of the process, we complete the risk assessment. We look at our options and we complete options appraisal. And there are times when, unfortunately, many people in the room won't want to hear it, that Type C isn't the answer. So there will be sites where the amount of water potentially ingressing into that site without an option to discharge it means we cannot use that as a viable form of water management. So we have to go to other options. But it's all part of that risk assessment. And I think what Steve was touching on, I don't know if he's still here. Oh, yeah, he is still. He can probably jump in. Is that sometimes it's not considered. We just say, okay, we'll put internal cavity drainage in there. We'll manage a potential ingress. We have a sump, we have battery backup, so we know that system's going to keep running, but where is it going, and at what point does it actually overload the outflow system and just start to fail on itself? And some of the guidance at the minute would actually lead you to believe if you're designing it at those levels, it is designed to essentially fail. Steve, do you want to jump in?
No, you just, yeah.
That's okay, yeah?
It's considerate. That's
Sweet.
That's the thing we've got to think about.
I'm sure that others will have other opinions, but yeah, I think it's the give due consideration and thought to the risk and how that will be managed by that system. We are bringing the source contamination or the risk, the water, the dissolved phase gas or contamination into close contact to a receptor, be it the building itself, reducing the design service life of the actual structure by allowing those contaminants through the structural element, or potentially putting the receptor, be it the humans or whatever's in the basement, little Timmy on his Xbox, at enhanced risk. No.
Well, let me have a go, Bob.
We'll have another do.
I'm not sure that I'm going to answer your question fully because it is a debate, and I don't think there is a clear answer. But to give you some background, I'm involved in the flood stuff. I've already mentioned that once today, and as part of the roundtable and other points of contact, I know just how sensitive the water companies are to discharging groundwater at any point into either combined systems or into stormwater systems. Because, well, I'll give you my own example. I live now in East Anglia rather than a proper county like Yorkshire. And we flood. And one of the modes of flooding is surface water flooding getting into the groundwater system and surcharging the lavatories on the ground floor. That's a problem. Now, we don't have many basements in East Anglia because if we did, they'd be full of water because we're built on gravel on a fluvial plain. But the fact is that even in areas like, let's say, Hebden Bridge in the Calder Valley, where I used to work, and that is highly susceptible to flooding, I can't tell you how many waterproofing systems I put in the 90s that discharged the pipe straight into the drain. How many times have you seen those communities up and down the Calder Valley go underwater and flood out? And that water that we're discharging in the initial phases into that flood are going straight into the drainage system. And I think we have to be really, really careful. Particularly if you're talking about large gardens and all that kind of stuff, you can discharge on the lawn. And actually, what's wrong with that? Soakaways, no. But, Graham, I'm going to call you out here. The flood protection systems that you're using, where do you discharge the water? Straight out, and as long as you bail it out faster than it comes in, there isn't a problem, if the water's relatively clean. But the fact is that the moment we start to take water and put it into a waste system, we open ourselves up to challenge, and that's particularly problematic in city centre locations when you're using large amounts of water. And I think that we have to be careful about not getting called to book on that.
Yeah. I mean, I ran an industry survey not long back, asking questions around a number of different things. One of them was related to design preferences in existing structures, and it was kind of I think the example was like a sort of a fairly low risk site, existing structure, and your options were Type C in isolation, Type A in isolation, and A and C combined. And the biggest preference was for combined A and C, and I think that's probably about as much as you could do to absolutely minimise what you do have to pump. I'm only saying that because like the results of that research sort of do seem to indicate a movement towards combined protection in existing structures. I wouldn't say that I see a lot of that in our neck of the woods. My assumption is it's in the south, it's probably happening quite a bit more. But
can I try, Bob?
Yeah, Bob, please come back. Sorry, Ben, you're next.
Yeah.
In the standard and what we should and shouldn't be doing. That was my question, is the contradiction. What about that?
Well, I'll let Ben come in a sec, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I kind of totally get the contradiction, because as we are told to consider it, and that may be a complete cop out. But is that a contradiction? I'm not sure.
So I think what you're touching on is Steve was saying that we shouldn't be discharging to stormwater, and highlighted 8102 says discharge to stormwater. I haven't checked what 8102 says, but personally I was suitably convicted, because I'm like, well, where the heck do we put the water? Because I'm not going to put it in a soak away. So I think Steve's got a really valid point, and something that we need to think through. My own experience is one of the jobs that we're working on, it's a 4-story basement in London. I don't think about it. I pass it on to the drainage engineer, and then the drainage engineer says to me, well, how much water are we going to be discharging? And we've already got secant piles, and then we've got concrete with a crack width of 0.2 with an additive. How much water is that going to let through? Well, it should be nothing. But what size pumps am I going to put in? I think we ended up saying we want pumps that can discharge 100 litres a minute. And if you go off to Thames and say, can we put 100 litres a minute into your combined sewer? Their answer is no. So I'm stuck in the middle of like, well, what do we do? And I think I'm actually quite comfortable being stuck in the middle, because I've got a design team, and we put our heads together and we say, what do you think, what do you think, what do you think? Because you just don't know everything. And I think that's a heck of a lot harder when it's a small refurb.
I think, like, specifically to that point, like, if it's fundamentally wrong, which Steve has highlighted, then obviously we flag that with BSI and we have that removed from the revision. So if there's a sentence or paragraph in there which is fundamentally wrong or misleading, which could potentially invite liability to you, which is, I think, specifically what you're asking, is we write to BSI and they will amend the standard if it's fundamentally wrong.
So there are still one or two, bits of communication between myself, BSI, and one or two in relation to comments. I mean, that particular point wasn't raised in any of the 300 and something odd comments that came in, okay? And every comment was, so at the moment we've had a couple of people questioning it, their comment wasn't put into 8102. Well, I mean, I won't be specific on it, but that particular comment would never get in probably any guidance document, let alone 8102. So if there are things, as Patrick said, there are things that need tweaking. So again, there is table 1 at the moment, I think it's spread over 2 pages. It's not great. So that's been requested to be reformatted and re-edited so it sits on the same page. So you've got table as it used to. Table 1 was table 1. At the moment, it doesn't look. So it's little things like that, and there are one or two other editorial. So it says institution of structural engineers rather than institute, and things like that. So there are still little tweaks being done, and if there are things that are fundamentally wrong, misleading, or that sort of thing, then yes, there is avenues to get those changed. But without notification of it to BSI, then it's not going to happen.
I mean, I don't know verbatim, but I'm pretty sure, it's not a get-out clause for the committee that did that clause, whatever it was, but I'm pretty sure is saying any discharge you need to get appropriate licences or consult with the right people, so that is in there. If those licences can't be granted, then you don't do it, I hope.
But it's obviously, if you're pumping water that's got potentially bringing contaminants from the outside, that's all part of your hydrological, geotechnical risk assessment, and you should know all that. If you're bringing in gases in solution and that sort of thing, and ultimately, no, you want to keep us outside of the structure, you don't necessarily want to bring it in. So you look at, so is a type C cavity drainage system appropriate in that situation? The answer would be no. There are other options, combinations of, etc., etc. So you're not, and that's where the change. If you then, if you're just talking about some, okay, let's call it clean groundwater that's coming in that hasn't got gas contaminants and things like that. Can you discharge? Well, nobody can tell you how much groundwater is coming in. So there are some seepage guidance references to so many litres per square metre per 24 hours and that sort of thing. But as Ben says, you start calculating out on a large footprint multi-level basement, you get to some staggering numbers, and you're into some staggering sized pumps. And again, you go to Thames Water in London and say, yeah, I'm going to discharge this into that, and they go, no. So there are occasions where using monitored pump systems, you can say, I can tell you exactly how much groundwater is going to get pumped, and you can bill accordingly. Yeah, because every time the pump goes off, it's going to discharge 53.5 litres of water. Yeah, and I can tell you how many times it does it. Yeah.
My own thought. Sorry to butt in. I think that you raised, and Steve has raised it, a really important point today. I think that we have to be really mindful, and this again is partly my job, isn't it? Is to try and peer down the road. And let's lock the doors before I make this statement. But using cavity drain systems in new build seems, if you stand far enough back from it, odd. And even though as an industry we're heavily invested in Type C, if we think of all the implications of the management of that ingressing water, and then you consider that when we're looking at climate change and future climate modelling and rainfall events and all of that stuff, it starts to get even more questionable. So I reckon that we'll be stood in here in another 15 years' time and we'll be talking about different things, and Type C will still be here, but we'll be doing new basements in different ways, and I don't think we'll be using quite as many hydrocarbons, or not hydrocarbons, but petrochemicals, shall we say, in basement waterproofing. I just think that we're on a journey where things change. And what I hope we're doing, even just by having this conversation now and changing our views and thinking about it, is actually getting to a point where we're changing our ideas before we're legislated against. Because if we have some real big mess-ups here, and let's say the authorities catch on to quite how much water we're putting into the drainage systems in, let's say, Kensington and Chelsea, then all of a sudden the moratorium isn't on a 3-storey basement because it's taking up too much ground and it's being too disruptive. It will be on any discharge of water into the system, and that kills it stone dead. So let's manage our withdrawal, if there is a slight withdrawal from this discharging, not have it imposed on us because we've ploughed ahead without thought. And if we do want to discharge, let's understand the reasons why that's the best way of carrying on. Sorry to kind of cap it off. Another question.
We've got a number of people now with questions, so over to Jade.
Me. Hello, can you hear? Steve here. I was going to answer Nick and Mark's point, but then the gentleman here interrupted with took over and let's move on with this very important area. Just quickly, Michael said that his recollection, and I'm with Michael on this, we did address this during 8102 revision, and my recollection without checking is that we put something like, and it may be a cop-out, in accordance with local regulations, whatever the approvals needed are. Yeah. Because we couldn't in one document say what you've got to do in Scotland and in Anglesey or whatever else. Okay, I wanted to pick up where Nick and Mark were coming from, and I just wanted to raise the issue of insurance. Listening to people saying about, I take design as Ben did, but I'd rather the contractors do or whatever. With me, the issue of responsibility does need to be very clear, but where I come from, and forgive me for saying it, you need to be insured properly. Now, the PCA, I know, and I'm not in touch with who has what, does have schemes with really good insurance for contractors, and I'm being in simple terms here, it's PI for design, it's PG, product guarantee, for the workmanship. So anybody taking responsibility for the design and or the workmanship, all I would say is, through PCA, make sure you're properly insured, because Mrs. Smith in Mike's version, I'm guessing that was a 300,000 claim Mike, something like that. Yeah. You wouldn't want that against you if somebody decided you were responsible because the system was there. That's 300,000. These projects on podium decks and so forth, I mean, you're into zillions. If you're OVARUP or whatever, you've got PI that will deal with a claim of that scale. But I would be, I just caution all of you to just make sure that you understand what you're taking responsibility for and that you have got the insurance, because it won't be cheap. And if you haven't got the insurance, one claim could finish you. So
Ian, are you in the room still? Go and see that man there.
It was this Ian here, sorry. Ian raised
this is our favourite insurer.
Yeah, of course, Ian. Insurance. Yeah.
I think,
okay, so I don't know what the panel think about that, but this business of taking responsibility, it really shouldn't be taken lightly, is all I say.
No, I mean, I agree, and I think Steve touched on it before. The document covers small residential basements, retrofit or remedial work, plus huge commercial buildings. And when you're looking at a big commercial project, it's impossible for a waterproofing contractor to be sat there as principal designer and have all the responsibility. That is possible on a small project. But as you rightly say, no one in their right mind turning over a couple of £1 million a year would walk in and take principal design responsibility on a £200 million basement. So you have to have that segmented project team in accordance with CDM, where everyone's filtering into the principal designer, which is usually an ARAPS or a big multidisciplinary consultancy. You're there to do your little specialist bit. I think the statistics don't lie, do they? We are a tiny portion of construction costs, but we're a huge part of claim. So it's.
Can I take one more panel member on this? If we have another respondent, I think we've got about 3 questions left. Is that right? And we've got 5 minutes, so that really doesn't fit. So I'm prepared to go over by 5. We're going to finish at 4:30. Sorry, Richard, but we can do this. But we'll have to be quick with our answers. If that's okay, guys. Yeah. Next question.
Thanks. It's related to the PI and also something you said, Steve, about improved quality and that this is a good step towards improving quality. Right from the beginning, one of the big challenges to even getting any work done in basements is the PI for architects. A lot of them are trying to steer away from it being part of their service in order to better keep those PI down. Do we think that actually this might be a good stepping stone towards assisting that, given that there's somebody else who's being defined as the key designer from the waterproofing point of view? Or should this be a step towards that? Could it be a step towards that? So it seems and it's to do with responsibility, as we've talked about.
So you pick that up?
I'll try. I hope so. That's personal interest, right? That's my business is built off that. I'm hoping that we become an appointment, just like the architect or engineer or M&E or acoustics or whoever. We get appointed by the client to do waterproofing, and the PI and stuff that scares me suitably, and that's something that I want to manage and make sure we do properly. But yeah, I hope that is where the industry goes, because it needs to. Architects know enough to get themselves in hot water, is my experience.
James, do you want to quick, if you don't mind?
The only thing I'd say is I think that contractors should have PI, should use PI and should take design responsibility, whereas I know there's a mixture of things that are offered, i.e. you might have PI but you don't necessarily want to take design responsibility.
The only thing I'll say about PI is it's bloody expensive, and the reason that people are walking away from PI is because they can't afford their premiums. And so, it's almost down to last man standing. Ian may have a different view on kind of where we are with the PI markets, but I was with some people yesterday in London talking about the new safety directorates on construction products and all the other things that are being drawn into HSE. The fallout has still not settled from Grenfell. We don't know where we are. We don't know the size of the liabilities that are going to come from that. We don't know where the responsibilities are going to sit. And until all that stuff sorts itself out and we understand what the new landscape looks like around construction products directives and all that kind of stuff, I still think we're in shit order with PI. So keep it if you can, pay your premiums, keep your noses clean, don't make any claims, and I think you'd be all right. Sorry, Sue.
Hiya, just a nice easy yes or no one. Used to be a bit of a joke that you could put a Type C system over the top of a internal Type A, effectively drilling 1,000 holes for it and call it a combined system. I wonder if that's still the case in the new revision.
I think you've just described a tea bag, haven't you?
I think you can, just don't drill 1,000 holes in it. Hang it from the top, and in certain situations, yeah, you can.
I agree. If any fixes are made, just make them with chemical anchors to retain the Type A consistency, and in my opinion, you've got both.
Yeah.
So yes, the answer is yes, simple yes.
Change your lining system in front of your Type C so you put in fewer fixings in. Well, it's not hard.
Yeah, or you could have a drain void, no membrane needed,
yeah.
No fixings.
That's true.
Done some resin injection into masonry and put cavity membrane over that. It's another way of slowing it down if you've got a really bad wet well.
So I think yes, sometimes.
Designed appropriately.
we don't say breathe. We don't use that term. Buildings don't have lungs, they don't breathe. So are we done? Are we finished? I think we're at time. So I'd like to say thank you to our panel, our team, and I will call them a team. We were a team, a slightly disparate team, but we were a team. But I'd like to say thank you to us, to everybody on the stage, and thank you to you.
Well, hello again. I hope everyone enjoyed the video and got some real good valued learning from both the BS 8102 update at the start, as well as from the main expert debate itself. Now, firstly, just following on from Steve, just at the end of that video, let me say a further thank you to our BS 8102 expert panel of Ben, Emily, James, Kevin, Michael, Patrick, and of course, our very own Steve Hodgson. In addition, let me just also say thank you to our technical manager, James Berry, for giving us a little bit of background and context to the BS 8102 paper and changes just prior to the debate taking place. Well, as you saw, folks, there was some real good, interesting questions over the day of the conference. There were some heated points of contention as well, I think it's fair to say. As with something like this, there is always some strong differences of opinion. And with those strong differences of opinion, there's always a degree of compromise in some of the points, sometimes within the document in itself. But I think we can all agree we have a very worthwhile document to move forward as best practice guidance for us all. Now, for those that just potentially want to learn a little bit more information about BS 8102, I just wanted to point you to a couple of resources. I think firstly that I wanted to point you to is to a training course that the PCE recently launched off the back of the paper in order to bring everyone up to speed, whether you're a PCE member or not. As it's titled there, it is our BS 8102 update course where it will go through all the kind of key changes, the differences between the old paper and the new paper, the key takeaways, the things that you really need to get on board with, and a host of additional knowledge that will come with that over the course of the training course itself. You can see the link there just on the screen, but you can, of course, just go to our website in the training and qualifications section, and you should be able to find it in there. For those that are looking for even more additional information, well, I think if I can point you straight away to the British Standards website, where you can pay for and download that document and effectively just read it to your heart's content. Now, if you are seeking some free information, there are two areas I would suggest you go to, certainly within the PC website. Firstly is the recent webinar that we did titled BS 8102 update. Does this change our view to waterproofing? That was only a couple of weeks ago, and there will be links in the notes and further down. In addition as well, there is several news stories, blogs on the PCA website that if you just simply go to the news section, type in BS 8102, you will be able to find those articles and get yourself up to speed. Now, just out with BS 8102, but sticking with structural waterproofing, for those that are keen to get themselves up to speed with other guidance notes and best practice, the first place I would point you to is to our waterproofing technical document library. Link is on the screen there, but again, all you simply need to do is just go to the professional section on our website, and you'll see the options for the technical documents. And there is a whole wealth of information in there, and it's just really just how much time have you actually got to absorb it all. There is as well some additional places where you can gain further information, which I mentioned it just there, our professional section within the website, and just go to the appropriate pages, or just our training and qualification side of the website, where you can look at further training courses associated with structural waterproofing. For all cases, however, all you simply need to do is just go to property-care full stop org. So that's property-care full stop org. Just prior to finishing off this video, I just wanted to let everyone know of some additional further learning coming up. Now, within the Property Care Association, we always have events taking place over the course of the year, and you can find out about those events that are coming up just simply by going to our website /events. It just so happens the most recent event coming up is our 2022 International Property Care Conference. Now, I will say this promises to be the most important and informative conference for the preservation and property care sector in decades. If you are a property professional or a surveyor, I would strongly encourage you to come along to this, both if you are a PCA member or not a PCA member. Again, you can simply just go to the link, it's just on the screen there, just property-care.org/events, and you will be able to see the links to it, and you'll be able to book online for it as well. Just before we go, and as always, I just want to say a big thank you to all those that stuck with us and watched the webinar right to the end. Look out for more of our 2022 Structural Waterproofing Conference videos coming over the next couple of months. In the meantime, check out the links on the YouTube notes, or if you're watching this on our webpage, simply scroll a little bit further down and you'll be able to find links to the webinars, to the technical documents libraries, and also to where you can purchase the BS 8102 document in itself. But again, thank you for watching, everyone, and hopefully that you look forward to the next video coming your way very soon.